Thank you, everybody, for coming to the Aaron Torres Podcast YouTube page. I do have one quick favor before we get to the video that you came here for, and that is very simply this. You see that little red subscribe button below this video? Go ahead, smash that subscribe button. It really does help me. It really does help this channel grow and my audience grow. So go ahead and hit that red subscribe button. And now, here is the video that you came here for. We obviously have the College Football Playoff Committee, which selects the 4 teams that make the playoff. So the polls are really just for something to talk about. But as I said, it never stopped anybody from yelling and screaming and complaining when the polls came out. And so with the first poll out Monday, I figured I'd do what every other college football fan is doing. Talk about it, react to it, and I'm going to give you 5 teams that I believe are either overrated or underrated in that first coaches poll. Let's get to the teams that I deem to be overrated and underrated again. With all the context of none of this really matters, but it isn't going to stop us from talk about it anyway. First of all, the first team that I deem to be overrated, drumroll please, number 5, Notre Dame is overrated. And listen, this isn't the typical Notre Dame sucks. They're overrated. They don't play anybody. They need to join a conference. I hate Notre Dame. That is not what I am doing here. But when I look back at Notre Dame from last year and when I really look at Notre Dame going into this year, a few things stand out. First of all, you go back to Notre Dame last year. Listen, I'm not an anti-Notre Dame guy. I think I've been more supportive of Notre Dame over the last couple years than anybody. What Brian Kelly did there is incredible. What I think Marcus Freeman is going to do is only build upon it. But you go back to last year, yeah, they finished 11-1. But you could pick some holes in that schedule. So they finished 11-1. Their only losses to Cincinnati. But look at who they beat. They beat USC, which fired their coach. We know that was the worst USC team in forever. Beat Virginia Tech, fired its coach. North Carolina, one of the most disappointing teams in college football. Notre Dame beat them. Stanford absolutely stunk. Notre Dame beat them. Florida State missed a bowl game. Notre Dame beat them. Wisconsin completely underachieved last year at 9-4. Notre Dame beat them. And so when I look at Notre Dame even going into this year based off last year, a couple things stand out. One, there are some years when people do the whole Notre Dame didn't play anybody, and it's total nonsense. Last year was not the year. Like I said, 2 of the marquee wins were over teams that fired their coaches, USC and Virginia Tech. 2 were against teams that were some of the most underachieving in college football, North Carolina and Florida State. Stanford stunk. Wisconsin underachieved as well. And here's the other reason that I know that Notre Dame probably wasn't as good as its record indicated a year ago. It's because Brian Kelly left Notre Dame for LSU when Notre Dame still had a chance to make the playoff. And so even Brian Kelly knew that while his team was 11-1 and had an outside shot at the playoff, they really weren't national championship caliber. And so moving ahead to this year, I see a very flawed Notre Dame team in Marcus Freeman's first season. And again, it's not a rip on Marcus Freeman. He's not going to do the job. I think he was the right hire. I think he was the right guy for this job. But you look at this team. They lose their starting quarterback, Jack Cohn. They basically have no really meaningful snaps at under center, from the quarterback position. Tyler Buckner, Drew Pine from Connecticut, baby. Both those guys were backups, got minimal snaps last year. They also lost their best running back, 1,000-yard rusher, Kyron Williams, He was basically their best offensive weapon. And the defense was fine last year, but it was hardly elite, and they lost a lot off that as well. Beyond that with Notre Dame, I understand that preseason rankings are supposed to be reflective of who you are now, not looking at the schedule and who you may be in November or December. But Marcus Freeman walked into a gauntlet of a schedule in year 1. First of all, we all know where Notre Dame's opening up the season, right? At Ohio State in the horseshoe against the school that Marcus Freeman played at, Ohio State. Good luck with that one. Outside of Alabama, I don't think anybody would even be favored or considered having a shot to win at Ohio State to open the season. Maybe Georgia. I don't know. The point being is that I do think that's going to be a loss right there. That's not a disrespect to Marcus Freeman. It's just the truth. Beyond that, I do think North Carolina is improved. They were terrible last year. I think they'll be good this year. That game is at North Carolina. They play BYU on a neutral field. But look at the final few games in the schedule. Return game. Clemson. Remember, Clemson played at Notre Dame a few years ago during COVID. It was one of the games of the year. It was the game that we thought DJ Uiagalelei was the next Deshaun Watson or Trevor Lawrence. Yeah, not so much. But Clemson comes to Notre Dame, and I'll tell you this. If DJ ain't the guy, they'll have made the move to back up Cade Klubnik by then. And then Notre Dame closes at USC, which is going to be a much tougher opponent than it's been in years. Keep in mind that'll be week 12 under Lincoln Riley. That team will have hit some sort of rhythm. And so I look at Notre Dame. 5 is just too high. 3 really tough games at Ohio State, at USC, Clemson, at home. No established starting quarterback. This is a good team, but they're probably an 8-4 to 9-3 type team. Second team, also overrated, the Baylor Bears at number 10. And listen, Baylor was an incredible story last year. And if you remember, year 2, under Dave Aranda, Matt Rule goes to the NFL. Year 1 is COVID. It's a mess. Start, stop. They had 1 million games canceled or postponed or delayed. And then last year, out of nowhere, they're this great story. They win the Big 12, final play of the game, go to the Sugar Bowl, beat Ole Miss and Lane Kiffin in that Sugar Bowl. But while they were a great story last year, let's look at them this year. I don't get the hype with them this year. They're the preseason Big 12 favorite. I like Oklahoma a lot more than them. You look at this team, they lost a 1,000-yard rusher, Abraham Smith. They lost their best wide receiver, Tyquan Thornton. And a defense which was really good and really veteran is now young and rebuilding. Now, they'll be really good up front, but they lose a bunch off the back end, including J.T. Woods, who led college football in interceptions with 6 last year. And I just look at this Baylor team. I see a good team. I see 8-4. I believe in Dave Aranda. I don't love them, though, and I would add this, too, with them. Their starting quarterback, Gary Buchanan, left in the offseason. And I understand. It's because he lost the job to Blake Shapen. I get all that. But at the same time, you're asking a quarterback that played one great game, and he was great in that Big 12 championship game. You're asking that guy to step in. And I don't see it. It's not that I don't think they're good. I think they're fine. I think we're talking about an 8-4 type team. But you look at a team that this year now has Oklahoma on the road, Texas on the road. Those were both wins last year. I don't see them as a top 10 team. I think they're probably in the top 20. I don't see them as a top 10 team. Third team, I also deem to be overrated. We'll get to some underrated teams in a minute. But how about those Texas Longhorns? And I'll say this in defense of Texas. If it was just about being ranked 18, I don't know that I would have so much of an issue with it. But check this out, and I'm sure many of you saw this. They got a first-place vote in this poll. Whoever gave them first-place vote needs to be fired from this job, and it's a free – you'll get paid for it. It's the coaches' poll. And so I don't know who voted for them, but you can't possibly justify having Texas as the number 1 team in the country. I don't even think you can really justify them having top 15, top 20. 18 feels about as high as you can go. And when it comes to Texas, it's really a lot of what I talked about on the last episode. And I'm not going to rediscuss every single thing that I talked about last episode. But this was a team that was obviously not very good this year. Last year, 5-7. They lost to Kansas. But what stands out to me about Texas going into this coming season is that there's a renewed excitement for 2 things that I don't know that we should be that excited about. One, I think a lot of the hype around Texas is just that they're killing it in recruiting in the class of 2023. Well, guess what? Arch Manning and all his buddies don't get to campus for another year. Has nothing to do with this year. And 2, yes, Texas killed it in the portal, but most of the guys that they brought in that are difference makers are on the offensive side of the football. Quinn Ewers at quarterback, Isaiah Nayor at wide receiver, Ajayi Hall from Alabama, Jaleel Billingsley from Alabama. And so what stands out to me about that is a couple things. One, you brought in a couple guys with a little bit of sketchy attitude issues. You know who I'm talking about, the kids from Alabama. Not saying they're bad people, but they left for a reason. And this is a program that, remember, it was just 2 or 3 months ago that we were talking about the idea of, we were talking about the idea that this was a program that very much was struggling with character issues still in their program. Remember, they had players during spring ball come out and say, I think some of our young guys are hanging out at the bar too much. I think they're having too much fun. I think they think they already made it just because they got to Texas. We can't have that. So that was the attitude this spring. And so I'm supposed to believe that this is going to change 360 degrees by the fall, by the time of kickoff. I don't buy it. Also, and I think this is important too, what did I just say? All those good players came in on offense. The offense wasn't the problem last year. It was the defense. It was a defense that gave up 57 points to Kansas, 55 to Oklahoma in the Red River game, 30-plus points to 7 of 9 Big 12 opponents. And so I could go on and on. But this idea that Texas is fixed because they got Quinn Ewers, the problem wasn't at quarterback. The problem wasn't at wide receiver. This is like a basketball player that is a great athlete, that dunks, that can throw down with anybody but can't hit an open jumper. It's him going into the gym and just practicing dunking. You got to get behind the three-point line and practice. It's basically Ben Simmons. Ben Simmons, we know you score 2 feet away. Shoot a three-pointer. Well, that's Texas. We know you're great on offense. That was never the issue. You got to get better on defense. And so forgive me, but I'm a little bit skeptical about Texas at number 18, and they certainly do not deserve a first-place vote. Let's get to 2 teams that I believe are underrated and should be ranked. And the first one is the Penn State Nittany Lions. And I'll say this. The internet does not like James Franklin. And I don't really get it. Now, I understand last year, 7-5, a little bit of a disappointment. COVID the year before, a little bit of a disappointment. So we're coming off back-to-back disappointing years. But from 2016 to 2019, James Franklin won 11 games, 9 games, and 11 games. Then COVID happened. Then last year he was 7-5. But even that 7-5 comes with a little grain of salt, because they were 5-0 going into a game against Iowa at Iowa. They were up 17-3 against Iowa in that game on the road, and their starting quarterback Sean Clifford got hurt, and they lost the game 20-17. Then they lost the next game to Illinois in 9 overtimes. And so when I look at Penn State, if Sean Clifford doesn't get hurt, I understand injuries are part of football. If Sean Clifford doesn't get hurt, they're probably looking at a 7-0 start going into Ohio State and 9 wins overall. So I don't think they're quite as bad as the record made them out to be last year. I would also say Sean Clifford is back at quarterback, and I don't think he's great, but I think he's serviceable. 5-star running back Noah Singleton. They got some difference makers. They got a kid out of the portal from Western Kentucky that could be a difference maker at wide receiver. But finally, I like the schedule. Remember, this was a team that last year had to play at Wisconsin and at Iowa, in addition to at Michigan State, at Ohio State, Michigan at home, Auburn at home. Well, they do still have Auburn in an out-of-conference game. They actually open at Purdue, which I think is a pretty tough game to start the season Thursday night, a couple weeks from tomorrow, actually, as you listen to this on Wednesday. But look at the rest of the schedule. They do not play Wisconsin at all this year. They played on the road last year. Do not play Wisconsin at all. They do not play Iowa at all. They do not play Nebraska at all. Maybe the 3 best teams out of the other division. They don't play at all. Finally, the in-conference games, they get Ohio State at home. They get Michigan State at home, or the interconference Big Ten East games. They get Ohio State at home, Michigan State at home. They do have to go to Michigan. Not saying they beat Ohio State, but at least they get them at home. I think this is a top 20 team. I think this could be, with the right breaks, the second best team in the Big Ten East. There's no reason that they shouldn't be ranked. Finally, let's go to the SEC. I don't get Tennessee not being ranked. Tennessee was a great story last year. First year, Josh Heupel, obviously all the Jeremy Pruitt stuff that we talked about earlier a few weeks ago. Josh Heupel comes in and they win 7 games. Josh Heupel comes in and they win 7 games against maybe the toughest schedule in college football. I don't think it was tougher than Arkansas, but you get the point. It's like they played a really tough schedule last year. You look at who they beat and how they beat them. They got better as the season went on. And as I've talked about many times with Tennessee, week 2 they lose to Pitt at home. Hendon Hooker, who ended up being their starting quarterback, did not start that game. If he starts that game, they probably win. Later in the season, they play Ole Miss. Hendon Hooker gets hurt late, and if he finishes the game, they could win that game. They were driving for the go-ahead score. So you do some quick math. Hendon Hooker starts against Pitt, finishes against Ole Miss. We're probably looking at a team with 2 more wins. This year, the schedule obviously isn't easy. They have Georgia on the road and Alabama at home. But I will say this. They get LSU in a cross-division game. Never easy playing at LSU. But if you're ever going to get LSU, this feels like the year that you want them early in the season when LSU is still figuring things out under Brian Kelly. They get Kentucky at home, which I think is a swing game. They get Florida at home, which I think is a swing game. And I'll just tell you, I think Tennessee is the second best team in the SEC East. Sorry, Kentucky fans, it's the truth. And I think they are underrated by not being ranked at all. I just want to take a quick break, Come back, and when I do, we are going to answer your questions. Mailbag segment, I got a few of them. We're going to answer all of them next. Talk a little bit about some NIL stuff. College basketball NCAA tournament. Could we be losing automatic bids? I think we might be down the road. Very dumb. We'll discuss that next.